Now we have the dissertation award, which will be announced by Kellogg Booth.
So the Bill Buxton Award recognizes outstanding doctoral dissertations in HCI. And for last year, 2020, Daniel J. Ray was selected from 8 nominations. More details are available on the CHCCS graphics interface websites under the awards section, both for this award and the other awards that will be given out later in the conference. Daniel earned his degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD in computer science from the University of Manitoba. His dissertation supervisor was Dr. James Young. The doctoral research resulted in 5 papers at top conferences. He did a postdoc at Kyoto University and then returned to Canada, where he's a faculty member currently at the University of New Brunswick. Dr. Ray's highly innovative dissertation, I'm now quoting from the award citation. The title was Now You're Teleoperating with Power, Learning from Video Games to Improve Teleoperation Interfaces, paves the way for an entirely new approach to designing teleoperation interfaces by integrating affective computing and social robotics concepts into the more typical command and control approach. Daniel developed and tested a wide range of prototypes that systematically considered the psychology of the person operating a robot in order to shape operator experience, improve operation effectiveness, and reduce errors. So it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel, congratulate him on the award. Like all of the award winners, there is a plaque that has been sent out, making its way via courier to the various awardees. And he will now tell us more about his dissertation. But congratulations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Booth. I'd just like to check that everyone can hear me and see my slides.
All good.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to note that they had incredibly good timing. I should be able to show you the plaque. It arrived yesterday, but apparently Purelator, I think, forgot there's a global pandemic going on. They seem to assume I wasn't home yesterday when it was delivered. So there's a notice. I hope to get it before the conference tomorrow morning. But alas, here we are. So yes, so thank you. I would like to, yes, I'm very honored to receive this award this year. And as Dr. Booth said, I was also very lucky to have my supervisor to thank for a lot of this, Jim Young. He taught me, I think, very well, and here I am. So let's get into the research, I think. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm currently at the University of New Brunswick as an assistant professor, and I'm here to present my PhD dissertation from the University of Manitoba. Now You're Teleoperating with Power, Learning from Video Games to Improve Teleoperation Interfaces. All right, so I'd just like to give a quick, get my screen focus in the right place. There we go. Just like to give it a quick kind of overview, because I think some of you may not be as familiar with the field of human-robot interaction, which is a subfield of HCI that is concerned about how people interact, as you might assume, with robots. And there's a variety of problems in this space, but I specifically was looking at teleoperation. And teleoperation is the ability to control a robot remotely. So usually there's an operator, the user, sits somewhere, perhaps in a room or a building that is far away from the robot, in the sense that you can't see them often. You might not be able to use any of your normal senses. All you know about the robot's surrounding area is given to you through an interface, perhaps a computer or a tablet. And this presents a lot of really interesting challenges. For example, building situation awareness, which is the idea of knowing what's around the robot. How do you keep track of what's behind you or what's moving around you when you don't have access to your normal human senses you're used to having? Some people say, well, let's add more sensors. Well, if you add more sensors, now you have to display them in the interface and communicate them effectively to the operator. And this might contribute to some workload and present some other interesting HCI challenges. Now, then the operator wants to do a task with the robot. That's why we have the robots in the first place. And so they have to send controls in some way to navigate and use this robot in the remote space. There's a lot of challenges. And this is not necessarily a very focused thing. Robots can be applied in a lot of ways, and all these challenges come up. For example, there are construction and industrial robots for inspection and maintenance. you might have seen telepresence robots such as this at a conference one day, where you can basically engage in social interactions in a space remotely. Robots have been used for remote tourism, for accessibility, and for a number of other issues, as well as emergency response robots, for example, firefighting robots that can go into places that are perhaps unsafe for people. Most famously, in the relatively recent Fukushima nuclear disaster, robots were sent in to help clean up when it was dangerous for people. But in all of these cases, you might think, well, there's a lot of different types of users with a lot of different types of expectations and tasks and training. But in all cases, it turns out teleoperation is extremely hard. It's difficult. People get confused or lost. They make errors. In the worst case, they'll actually collide with the robot into something or someone, perhaps causing damage or injury. And it's fairly well documented at this point that this causes a lot of stress via workload because it's just so difficult to keep up with. And one question might be why? Well, if we look at a nicer teleoperation interface, I say this because I actually think it's good. I have no association with this company, but I just want to say that most commercial teleoperation interfaces that you see are much, I think, not nearly as well designed in my own opinion, but there's still a lot going on in this interface, right? So you might notice at the side, there's like a number of robot statuses, batteries and voltages, temperatures, humidity, all speeds, all sorts of things going on, as well as controls. You can click buttons for some high-level controls to make your robot do tasks. And you might be doing this task to maybe navigate around an environment and complete some objectives, all within a dynamic and complex environment into which you're trying to perceive via the robot. This is a lot of difficult problems right here. And one of, the things you have to do as a PhD student is you have to sit and say, well, what's my topic going to be? How am I going to approach these problems? And so I did what any good PhD student does when faced with a lot of open questions. I instead played video games. So at that time, it was actually 2015, and I was actually playing this video game, Dragon Age. But I had a realization that, wait a second, here I am controlling 4 characters. Each of these characters have a bunch of statuses: armor, health, magic, these kind of things. They have complex controls. I can cast spells, engage in teamwork, defend, etc. I'm trying to accomplish certain objectives and navigate an environment that's dynamic and complex, just like robots, all the way down to the zombies trying to kill you, which, well, maybe one of those things isn't the same with robots. I'm not sure quite which one, but I'll leave it for future work to figure that one out. But the core idea here is that it seems like the problems overlapped really heavily. That was my intuition at the beginning of this. And I thought, well, video games have, for years, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of games, iterated with a lot of expertise and effort into a number of interfaces to help solve these problems. And maybe some of those solutions could be used in teleoperation. However, there's this question. I mean, teleoperation in the end has been traditionally viewed as this idea of, let's use a robot as a tool to accomplish a task. It's very functionally driven. Well, games have been more experience driven. They're trying to create entertainment or a certain feeling. And actually, a lot of research has noted that games are kind of unique, maybe not unique, but characterized in difference to other software about their focus on player psychology and experience. That's their point. So maybe they don't necessarily work together, but it seems like the problem spaces are shared. So I thought I'd investigate this in a more systematic way. So overall, in my thesis, my approach was to look at these teleoperation problems and similar problems in video games, see what solutions they had. And in particular, I tried to focus on solutions that in some way took advantage of player psychology. Understanding that, to take inspiration and build a new teleoperation interface out of it and see how that affects people's performance and their experience, and whether user experience was even relevant to the teleoperation tasks. And so I did this systematically by looking at a number of games, which I'll talk a bit more later about, but I'd like to share a few individual projects from the thesis that I think really outline some of these major themes. And at first, I'd like to start talking about how people think about robots, how they perceive them. And I'll start by backing away from games and robots and asking a simple question. which of these two cars do you think moves faster? Now, you might think, well, maybe this is a trick question, but it's not that complex. The idea is maybe the bottom car. Why? Well, maybe it drives by you. It has a really loud muffler, and maybe it's the flames, the shiny wheels. It looks sporty, and the one up top just looks like a commuter car. Now, what's happening here is we're taking a bunch of different stimuli, using our experience, and we're making a judgment about the capabilities of this car. And traffic psychologists have found that this affects how we might approach actually driving it. You might be a little nervous sitting into the bottom car simply because you might expect it to be very powerful or fast, so you might drive it more safely. So in this way, our expectations of capabilities can shape how we drive. Video games embrace this. Actually, many driving games specifically outline the capabilities of each individual racer. For example, this one on screen is rated to be very fast, but it accelerates slowly, perhaps due to a higher weight. And this actually informs the player of viable driving strategies. For example, this one might encourage a more reckless style or slightly less safe style because you don't want to hit the brakes and slow down because it would take you a long time to recover that speed. Games have gone even further in this much older games. Apologies for the lower resolution screenshot, but it is quite old. In this game, the developers have actually gone on record with something really interesting relatively recently, is that they ran out of time to balance their driving video game. So they actually made every single racer race exactly the same performance, but they left in these graphics that said, oh, this one's faster, this one's heavier. Now, people didn't know this. Even playing the game for dozens of hours, people still developed strategies and felt like they drove each car differently. And so I thought this was awesome. Can I use this kind of idea of shaping perceptions of capability, maybe making somebody believe a robot is fast or hard to break, in other words, dangerous, and maybe encourage a safer style of driving? And I approached this with a number of methods, but the core idea was I want to see how people really thought about, how I could prime different perceptions and how people saw that. So I had people come in and I said, hey, you'll be helping us test 3 different robots. And, that's fine. The robot's in another room. It's teleoperation. They couldn't see it. But in reality, there was only ever one robot. And we just changed we used various methods to shape their perception. And in each case, I think this is really important to note, is everyone drove all 3 different robots. And we had them compare and contrast their experiences, and later we looked at their performance. And there's more to this, but there's 3 methods I'd like to mention that we looked at. And one was actually changing robot capability. We kind of changed how it accelerated or how fast it could go, these robots, and we saw how that was perceived as from a remote experience, an operator sitting in a different room, but also how it changed their experience. But then we approached that kind of game design idea where maybe there wasn't any actual change to the robots. And in fact, we used the exact same robot with the exact same, speed, velocity, capabilities. All we changed was the characteristics of the controller. We had a joystick where we could change the stiffness in the joystick. And we had this kind of stand in for a difference in the robots, and we saw how that shaped perceptions. And finally, we took that extreme game example where we simply printed out sheets that were the spec sheets of the robot, and we explained them to participants. We just gave them the paper and said, you'll be driving this robot now. As you can see here, it doesn't balance really well. It's kind of fragile, but it drives really fast. And then we had them drive through obstacle courses and compare these robots. And skipping a lot of details here, but the core thing that happened is even after driving all 3 robots for 30 to 60 minutes or more, being able to compare and contrast them, we managed to shape perceptions. The people believed the ways we aimed to design, their experience. And in fact, even this paper-based version where we described these capabilities, we had participants say things like, oh, on this robot, this fast one, it was hard to keep the balance on this robot. It was light, it had more speed. And this was seen throughout our methods to shape perception. And in fact, some of our methods even managed to change how safely people drove, resulting in changes in numbers of collisions. All just by all based on this approach of just saying, okay, how do people think about what the robot can do, and how does that change how they drive it? So this was done over a number of studies. We actually have an interesting follow-up coming out soon that I'd love to talk to you about. But there's a lot more to this. And it's not just about how we perceive the robots people control and how the interfaces might shape, or the environment might shape those perceptions. There's also things about the experience itself. the performance of the driving. And I'll walk back a bit to cars again, and I'll ask if any of you have been in a situation something like this. Maybe you're the kid, or you're teaching your kid to drive, and somebody starts panicking, the driver starts panicking, and now everyone's panicking, and the performance changes, right? So this is an interesting part of, it's not actually part of the interface of the car, right? There's still steering wheel and brakes, but there's a social interaction here that informs performance, informs the driver's behavior and experience while driving. And we thought, well, there's a lot of work in robots and how we react socially to them. And so we thought, well, that's really interesting. Have games kind of leveraged the social aspect for the characters you control? And as you might guess from the thesis topic, they certainly did. Even back in '93, there's this famous game known as Doom. It's an old shooter game. You can see the hand holding a gun out front here. And there's all these like statistics at the bottom, health, ammo, etc. But I'd like to draw your attention to this, right? This face at the bottom. This is a representation of the player's character. And if you look at it while the player's like playing the game, it's live. It reacts to the game around it. You know, if an enemy appears and shoots your character, he acts surprised. If he picks up a power-up, he gets excited. And also it changes based on these character stats. You know, as health goes down, he starts, you see here, gets a bloody nose and starts getting more and more kind of injured. And so it's at once kind of a social summary of information that can quickly be communicated to players, but it's also builds empathy with the player character. And maybe the player looks down and goes, wow, like look at this face. Like it's kind of shocked. Like maybe I should be careful. My character's in a tough spot here. And so we thought, yeah, could we get this kind of empathic response to some sort of design, some sort of behavior or performance aspects and affect behavior and experience? So we designed some personas that did this, and they took teleoperation velocity and collisions and reacted to that. For example, seemed pretty happy at the start here, but we took off really fast and we had some collisions. Suddenly not looking so comfortable here, kind of reminding us of that panicking dad in the picture earlier. But perhaps the operator empathizes with this and starts to calm down and slowly drive safer. And the passenger here, the backseat operator, so to speak, gets happier and happier. Now we actually performed multiple different types of, we created multiple agents that reacted to the same information differently. But what we found is, despite driving maybe similarly with these interfaces, people had different kinds of experiences. And specifically, we changed the way they felt about the operation emotionally, specifically valence and arousal. If you know these terms, we could make somebody have a more positive or negative kind of feeling associated with their experience, or the amount of kind of energy of that emotional reaction. So we could change how people perceived, you know, the robot in the experience. We could see how we could change how they themselves experience the teleoperation on a level. But we can also, we found, change the perception itself of how we process the information. Now, if we look at certain types of robot cases, up till now, we've only been looking at controlling one robot. And that is difficult enough. Let me tell you, I've done it a lot. But one of the cool things about robots is perhaps they're moving kind of autonomously, and as an operator, you're supervising them, right? And maybe these 4 robots are exploring a space, looking for equipment that needs some sort of maintenance. And maybe that's characterized by a green light that you have to find. That's your operator task. Now, this is actually really difficult. I'll ask you to find 2 of these green lights in the following video. There's no actual sound, so. Do you catch them? It's actually really hard, right? And I know the video over YouTube will be fairly difficult, but the thing here is, like, there's so much information, it's so stressful to process. And one of the ideas is, well, with all the advanced computer vision techniques we have here, we could point out kind of areas of interest that the operator can double check and see if we need further attention in a certain area. But we should be careful about how we present that information to them. And to understand what I mean by this, we should look again at video games. Even early on, games had already developed many interfaces that could direct your attention very strongly. In fact, this interface, these yellow triangles, are probably drawing your attention so strongly you're having trouble paying attention to what I'm saying. And this is part of the difficulty. If we make an interface that's too good at directing your attention, you might be distracted and have trouble paying attention elsewhere. And this is bad with robots, because if you miss a person, you know, you're looking at this interface and you miss a person about to walk in front of your robot, you might injure somebody. or the other types of serious errors. So we actually looked at this trade-offs and how to design attention drawing interfaces. And we did this in a number of design variables, including the size of the interface we used, whether it was animated or not. We did this over a number of kind of implementations, for example, by blurring things that aren't near the target, darkening it, only blurring the target, animating in different ways and different styles of movement, brightening, color, size, and combinations of these variables. There's a lot going on here. But we did this over a very intentional multi-stage design iteration process. And each time taking what worked best and trying to improve it further or cover weaknesses. I'd like to show you one of the final ones. And the core point here is all design interfaces helped, actually. So you couldn't really lose by any of these game-inspired interfaces. They help people find more of these areas of interest, found them faster, and reduced that energy used in paying attention. But just to show you one of the last ones we came up with, one of the best ones, was lifted directly from video games. I'll show that a few more times because it's actually really interesting. What happens is you will always see it. It passes every pixel on screen, and the movement itself naturally draws your attention to its direction. And so you'll see where it's pointing it out. And then it stops animating to allow you to direct your attention elsewhere, and only taking kind of a third of a second to do so. And this all works based on known psychology about how we process visual information. And this can improve teleoperation. So that was a lot of projects, and I have to wrap up soon. But there's even more. So my thesis is online, and this wasn't just like a cherry-picked examples of video game kind of projects. What we actually did was we have a systematic survey that is still unpublished, but we're working on it, where we saw a number of games, and even on a small number, 30 or so, we were quickly converging on a lot of core kind of design principles shared between all these interfaces and the problems they're trying to solve. And so we kind of built a framework to describe this, and it helps us discuss all these game-like interfaces, not on a one-by-one basis, but on a higher level, as well as evaluate them for teleoperation. So if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to talk about it, and you can read about it in the thesis chapter. So the last thing I'd like to talk quickly, because they're going to pull me off a stage soon, is that, what can I learn from all of these projects? What can you learn from all of these projects? You don't work with robots, maybe. But I think the core thing is, going back to the beginning, is that teleoperation is seen as a functional task, much like maybe computers were originally. And what I saw wasn't necessarily new. The idea that user experience or games are fun has been studied in HCI for years. But I think there's this mindset in teleoperation that they're tools to do jobs, serious work. But what I found is that this user experience is an end goal in and of itself, right? I saw that people could be more positive about their driving, have more confidence in their product, think it could perform better than it actually could. And sometimes, even by creating a good experience, we actually increase performance, which is something we would desire as well. So it's not just about improving the robots, adding more sensors. We should think a lot in robots and maybe other places in software about targeting that user experience, which is one place I hope to go in my future research. So that's what I did. I looked at teleoperation problems, looked at game solutions to similar problems, and how they worked, kind of playing off of player psychology. I used those as inspiration to build a number of new interfaces. And I hope you enjoyed that high-level overview of my thesis. Thank you again for the honor of this award, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for a great summary and wonderful work and a well-deserved award. So I'll turn question handling back to Ahmed, but if there are questions, we do have about 5 or so minutes time before our break. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Ray, for excellent talk and very impressive work. We haven't received any questions yet, so just to warm up the podium, I'll ask a question myself. I was wondering, you mentioned that it's possible to influence perception or how users perceive robots by using deception. And I was wondering that whether you have studied a long-term effect of that whether this deception can last longer. Because I would speculate that when users are using the robots for a longer period of time, they'll figure out that they're practically behaving the same.
Yeah, so the quick answer is no, we didn't study more than the 30 to 60 minutes that I described. Some people went a little longer. It wasn't time constrained. But we based our work off of this concept of priming, which you might be familiar with, the idea of giving stimuli to users, and they draw from their past experiences, and then this affects how they might think or act. And work in this kind of area, this much a much older work area in psychology, has shown that you can prime in a longer term. This might be days, it might be weeks, and in some I think there's one of the papers that I read even had priming effects up to a year later. And there's also work on you could reapply priming or use different types of stimuli to prime. So there's a number of ways this could be introduced, I think, to robots. So I don't think it's just a temporary thing. There's also another argument that's really interesting is about first impressions with technology, right? A lot of our exposure and our opinions are made in that first kind of few moments with people, and I think technology as well. I think if we see anything from this rise in unboxing experiences and these kind of things, it's really important to have a good impression right out the box, so to speak. So I would say it's useful in the short term, but also there is evidence in psychology this could be long term, but that is unknown currently in the application to telerobotics.
So I have a
Great, thank
question.
you.
I have a question if there aren't any others.
Yeah.
Okay, so our opening speaker talked a lot about AI and how to apply it for text entry. So in your talk, especially at the end, you were looking at visually bringing the operator's attention to particular areas of the screen. And you noted that this is a standard technique in games. So in games, the world is a make-believe virtual world, which is driven by the game software. So at least in principle, if the software is well written, it actually knows where you should be looking. And therefore, the part of the problem that I think you were looking at, which is how do we draw attention without overly drawing attention, is important. But
yeah,
in a robotics teleoperation system, I think you also have the problem of how does the system know? So you're actually going to rely on the AI. And I'm imagining that, I mean, if the AI were so good, we always knew where to tell the operator to attend to, why would we need an operator anyway? The AI would just run the robot. So there's a tension between those two. And you're no longer, when the system is no longer so sure that where it's drawing your attention is where it should draw attention, do you think this is going to change the constraints on the technique?
Yeah, that's a really deep question. There's a lot of levels there, right? And
I only want you to answer the whole thing in the next minute.
Okay, yeah, it's so easy. Yeah, no worries. No, I think to talk about like the idea of virtual worlds having perfect information, I think that's a good point. One of the other things I didn't talk too much about is there was a technical, like there's a feasible technical explanation for why teleoperation games wouldn't overlap, which was exactly the reason you mentioned, is games have perfect information. We have noisy sensors, we have uncertainty, we can make mistakes. We actually built that into our study. We had cues, our attention drawing cues would sometimes draw attention to places where there was nothing, and sometimes wouldn't cue some of the areas of attention. So we built that in. We didn't find any statistical results on that, and it's something that would be interesting to follow up on, because we are actually worried about over-reliance. Would people stop searching if the system was so good? Which brings you to your second point of, if it was so good, why even bring it to the operator's attention? For a lot of these tasks, there's a lot of levels, right? You have to control your robot, you have to identify things, but then you also have to decide what to do with it. And the example I gave is like, oh, the light's on, you should get it checked, right? So maybe that's not as exciting of an example, but if you're doing like a drone survey, these are quite common these days, or even search and rescue teams will send these drones. You see something, you have to make a call about deploying, valuable expertise and human resources to an area. So before you make that call, AI might be close. They might even be 95% correct. But if you're sending drones to survey after an avalanche, that 5% chance being wrong might be a pretty serious mistake. So you want an operator or some experienced person to take a look at that guess by the AI and be like, yes, that is what we want. Let's take these courses of action. So in a lot of situations, you still want that human intervention. AI is kind of like a tool to get us closer and do a lot of the work for us. But in the end, we need to make the decisions about what to do with that information.
So maybe one just very short add-on. So I sort of a trick question, and I said, well, gee, in games there's perfect knowledge, but actually, if you look at multiplayer games, the game engine does know what the capabilities are and the positions, but it may not know the intent of the other players. So do you think that you kind of fully explored the benefits of learning from multiplayer games? Because I think it looked like a lot of your stuff was more single player games.
For sure. And I think there's just a clarification. So in the actual systematic survey as well, we specifically looked at types of games we thought would be more applicable to teleoperation, which is like maybe 3D, controlling 1 to n characters in a virtual world, right? And we did look at a few multiplayer games, but they didn't come up as often. They weren't focused on. So I think there is areas to improve on that. But I'd like to say that even in the few we did say, for example, one of the ones we looked at was, if you're familiar with StarCraft, which is a multi-unit control game where you have to keep a lot of information in your head. A lot of the interfaces that are given to the player to make decisions are still kind of instantaneous information, right? This computer doesn't make judgments about what will happen. It just says, hey, look, you should pay attention to this. This is all something that the operator should be able to see. But that said, in other games, when things are happening off screen by other players, this idea of fairness, people might, in games, they might feel, oh, it's unfair. I didn't see that person in the multiplayer game coming along. They do clever things like, have sound cues that are louder when an enemy player is doing things. And this is something we could, implement in a robotic system. Maybe going back to your earlier point, maybe an AI is unsure about what to do with some stimuli. Maybe it can emphasize that to the operator, there's this person coming to your side. I'm not sure if it's going to collide with our robot. I'm going to emphasize that stimuli to make you pay attention to it. And now the human can make that decision about what to do with it. So there is still lots to learn, I think, definitely from multiplayer and other types of games. There's like mobile games. There's a lot of areas we didn't have the time to look at. But yeah, there's a rich tapestry of areas to draw from that could be applied to a lot of situations.